Hi, this is Ultimate Questions, an introduction to philosophy. My name is Mark Thorsby, and today we've been looking at this question about what is truth. And today we're going to take a look at how Aristotle understands the world and what's true or not in the world in terms of his discussion of the unmoved mover, which relates to change. So, welcome, and it's good to have everyone. I want to begin this morning by drawing your attention to a very famous painting here. This is the School of Athens by Raphael. Um, and this painting commemorates all of the various philosophers in the ancient Greek world. Now, in fact, all of these different characters in the painting are meant to be the philosophers. And so, if you're looking for a little extra credit, feel free to send me an email that labels who each one of these people are. And that's not as easy as it sounds. Most of them we know who they are, but some of them are very difficult. But really, I wanted to draw your attention to this painting not because it's a beautiful painting, but because of the two central characters right here in the middle. And let me see if I can zoom in a little bit here for you and give you a tight and clean shot. On the left-hand side is Plato, and on the right-hand side is Aristotle. Now, you can see that Aristotle is a young man, whereas Plato is an older man. And that's because Aristotle, and I'll talk a little bit about his biography in a minute, Aristotle, who's the sort of one of the next critical philosopher in the ancient world, right? Notice, for instance, that Raphael puts them at the very center, where all of the sort of lines of the horizon are reaching towards these two guys. They're at the very center of the entire painting. And notice Plato. Plato's pointing upwards, right? And we can ask ourselves, what is Plato pointing at? Well, Plato's pointing towards the forms. Remember, truth for Plato is dependent on the distinction between being and becoming. The world we're experiencing, right, is the realm of becoming. Everything's in a constant state of change. The realm of being is the realm of the forms. The root word eidos, right? And there's these transcendental objects, these forms that provide the reality to the things we're experiencing down below in the realm of becoming. So something is true, or one knows truth for Plato if one can reach up and get up to those forms. So in this painting, Plato here is pointing upwards. He's pointing to the forms, but notice his student here, right? His junior, Aristotle. He's younger, but notice he's pointing downwards. And we might say that what Aristotle's suggesting here is he's saying, while Plato's saying the real world's up there, Aristotle's saying, no, this is the real world. The world around us, the world we're living and existing in, this is the real world. And if we want to understand it, we have to understand this. And we're going to see that Raphael captures a sort of intellectual gesture of Aristotle here, because we'll see Aristotle is committed to this idea that one can't just cogitate their way to the truth. One can't just close your mind and think about the forms and their purity through the dialectical method of Socrates and Plato here. You can't simply close your eyes and meditate and figure out all of the things that can be known about the world. Aristotle says, no, you have to actually go out and look at the world. One of the things that's instructive here is Aristotle is considered one of the first botanists and biologists, right? He's one of these first people who actually goes out, and we're told at least, that Alexander the Great would send him back botany and biology samples. Aristotle thought that we can't just know about dogs by thinking about dogness, as Plato suggests. Rather, if we want to know about dogs, we've got to go out in the world and actually observe them. And this reveals a fundamental difference in approach. And so when Raphael paints them at the very center of the painting, in many ways, you might say that both Plato and Aristotle, they offer us the two principal paths that philosophy seems to take. On the one hand, with Plato, we have this upward path, this path of rationalism, we might call it. The idea that reason alone can provide us with knowledge. And then on the other hand, with Aristotle, we get this idea of an empiricism. The idea that no, knowledge begins with our experience of the world. And we're going to see that as a result, they have vastly different approaches. So, welcome. So this is Aristotle's Unmoved Mover, a primer on Aristotle's conception of the world. I hope you can see here that Aristotle, there's a sort of fundamental difference. Now, let me talk just a little bit briefly here about Aristotle's, I want to talk briefly about Aristotle's biography and just talk a little bit about who Aristotle was. The first important thing about Aristotle is that Aristotle was not actually Athenian. He lived in ancient Athens, but he was originally Macedonian. His father was the doctor to Philip of Macedon. Philip of Macedon was the first great emperor of the Macedonian Empire. His son would be Alexander the Great. So they're actually from Macedonia. Now, that in terms of the ancient Greek history, after the Peloponnesian War, that was the war between Athens and Sparta. After that collapsed, after the sort of stalemate and the destruction of the Hellenistic states, we see, and that's when we get sort of Socrates and Plato writing in these people. But the Greeks become too weak to defend their own interests and to maintain their own imperial aspirations. And so what happens is the Macedonians come in and they sweep over, and since the Greeks are so decimated in terms of their capacity to build armies, they just quickly fold. And the Macedonians take over. And they would continue to take over, and then eventually Alexander the Great would take over for the Macedonians. Now, Aristotle, essentially from the aristocratic upper class of the Macedonian Empire, was privileged to actually attend Plato's academy. As we mentioned previously, Plato formed the first school in philosophy. I shouldn't say the first school, but one of the first major schools, called the academy, where we get the term academics from. Think about that as the very language of Plato's school is embedded in every institution in the world of education. But Aristotle, he attended Plato's academy for nearly 20 years, and he was one of the best students. In fact, we seem to have evidence that Aristotle expected, upon Plato's death, to actually take over as head of the academy. That did not happen, unfortunately. The job went to Plato's nephew, and that made Aristotle very angry, and so Aristotle left. So Aristotle leaves Athens, but after 20 years of being in the academy. And then as he moves forward, he eventually begins tutoring Alexander the Great, very famously. And then after that experience, he comes back to Athens and founds his own school called the Lyceum, which is named after a field in Athens. And he starts his own school, the Lyceum, sort of competing, if you will, with the academy. But we'll see here that while the Lyceum had a very different worldview, because Aristotle had a very different conception of philosophy, or at least different philosophical conclusions than did Plato, but he has extraordinary respect for Plato. In fact, all throughout Aristotle's metaphysics, he refers to Plato and the people of the academy as the friends of the forms. So, and then Aristotle goes back to the academy and stays there for pretty much most of his career, up until Alexander the Great dies in India. When Alexander the Great dies, the Macedonian Empire begins to collapse. And what happens is the Greeks take their opportunity and try to expel all of the Macedonians out of Athens, including Aristotle. Famously, though, they actually began to build up charges to execute Aristotle, very similar charges to those that were leveled against Socrates. Famously, Aristotle says, "I will not let the Athenians sin against philosophy twice," and he flees town, and he dies a year later. So, but the Lyceum continued to exist for hundreds of years, as well as the academy. So the Lyceum is a really sort of important accomplishment of Aristotle's. Now, one of the things I want to say a little bit about Aristotle, in terms of his intellectual biography, is that Aristotle is one of these first thinkers to really make a distinction between physics, right, biology, botany, cosmology, logic, even literary criticism. he has a book called Poetics, which if you ever take a literary criticism course, that's probably the first book you'll read. He has books on metaphysics, right? He has books on um, well, ethics, of course, politics. I once heard a philosopher say that if there was ever a case to say that there's life, there's alien life, maybe Aristotle's the example because of all of the different things he's able to do. In fact, the key thing we might say is that Aristotle is something of the father of not modern science, but the father of what we might call archaic science. And he's the first person to really make these key scientific distinctions. I wouldn't say he is the first, but he's the first to do it comprehensively. We know that he also he had a huge library, and he was collecting as much information as he could. Aristotle is one of these philosophers who's just addicted to ideas, and he's constantly collecting information. Alexander the Great was actually sending him, we're told, botany samples from India, as he was trying to classify different types of species and do biology. He even has discussions on the weather and how the weather works. Now, of course, many of Aristotle's theories are proven to be false, but it's quite admirable to see someone doing this in the ancient world. In fact, it's such a foundation that today, many of the distinctions that Aristotle made in the sciences we still hold today. For instance, the distinction between genus and species you may have heard of. This is actually a distinction that Aristotle makes in his Logic. Most of us have probably heard of genus and species when we think about Homo sapiens, right? And this is when we think about biology and the way in which we classify human beings, right? Humans have a genus of Homo, and we have the species sapiens, so we're Homo sapiens. This is the genus-species distinction, but in Logic, the genus to species distinction simply means that the genus is the larger category, and a species is a member of that category. That's all it means. And so, but it's important because what Aristotle does is by making this distinction between genus and species in his Logic, he lays this as a rubric, as a foundation for all the other sciences, and we've continued with that tradition. We haven't changed it at all. And so when you're taking your science class and you learn genus species in biology, evolutionary biology or something, you're essentially learning something that was first established in terms of its pattern by Aristotle. So it's quite remarkable, actually, what Aristotle was able to achieve. But there's so much Aristotle adheres to a form of empiricism. Now, what do I mean by empiricism? And to be clear, Aristotle never uses this language himself. But what we mean here, if you recall from our first lecture on the taxonomy of philosophy, empiricism is an epistemological category which concerns knowledge. Right? This is an epistemological category, and this concerns our theory of knowledge. Now, of course, if we're talking about truth, then that means that this is an important distinction. But empiricism means something like knowledge through experience, right? Through experience. And Aristotle thinks this is definitely the case because Aristotle tells us that knowledge begins with sensation, right? We first have sensations, and then with our sensations we gain memory, right? We sort of experience these same sensations over time, and then they sort of become sedimented in our memory. And then over time we eventually begin to form opinions about our experiences. And then once we have science, we can begin to gain knowledge about them, about what our sensations mean. Now, but here's the idea for Aristotle. Even though knowledge begins with experience, not everything that's real has to be experienced. Aristotle, he has a metaphysics, right? And his metaphysics, right? His metaphysics is essentially an explanation for the physical sense experience. Sorry about that, my handwriting there. So, what am I saying here? Is that he thinks that knowledge begins with sensation. We gain memory, we gain knowledge, and this sort of thing. We have this experience. But what metaphysics studies is it's an explanation for the types of physical experiences we have, right? The idea here is that we have we have a world that exists in a certain sort of way that we're experiencing. And metaphysics tries to understand what has to necessarily be the case such that the world is as it is. That is, metaphysics is after the fundamental structure of being or of existence that makes the world possible such that we have the experience we do. Right? Now, what Aristotle says is that he calls that what metaphysics is after in terms of this structure of being. This sounds really fancy. We might just say that metaphysics is after what he calls first principles. First principles. That is, he wants to understand, not just, he wants to understand that we have this experience, but what is the principle that undergirds the world? This is the first principle he's after, right? And we might say that a principle is something like a rule that guides one's reasoning. Now, you can never demonstrate a principle. You can only accept the principle, right? And so that means that knowledge begins with the experience, but we deduce the first principles. So these are a result of deduction. And deduction just means reasoning by necessity. That is, we figure out that if the world is arranged in such and such a way, what necessarily must the world be like, right? And that's what these first principles are after. Now, so knowledge begins with experience, and then we move through deduction. You're going to see we're going to do the same thing today in the video, right? Because what we're going to first talk about here is the idea that we have substances that we experience. And then we're going to talk about how are those things caused, and then how can we categorize our experiences, and then finally we're going to end by talking about change. And that's going to lead us into this question of first principles, and it's going to lead us into this discussion of Aristotle's called the unmoved mover. Okay, so that's sort of what we're going to do in our lesson today. So let me just get another window open here. And what I want to talk about in this section is Aristotle's conception of substance. Okay, substance. Okay, now the word that Aristotle uses here in Greek is actually ousia. Right, ousia. So this is actually the word he uses. Well, here, let me just give you the English. And this is the word for being, and I say being here, but with the lowercase b. We're talking about types of beings, right? Anything that exists that we ever talk about has being. Now, we should be clear, substance is not, Aristotle's not a physicalist, so he doesn't think that every substance has to be physical, but every substance does have being. So, I'm drinking a cup of coffee, so this coffee cup, for instance, is a substance. It has some sort of existence. It's here. Now, remember, we're beginning with what we experience, so we're not saying that must be some sort of hidden secret being. We're saying that this thing has being right here. And so physical things have substance. I'm a substance, I'm a being, but also non-physical things, non-material things. I should be a little bit careful by not saying material, but non-physical things. So, for instance, think about this. Think about Shakespeare's sonnets, right? Shakespeare's sonnets, in a certain way, they always exist on paper, but they're not just a paper, right? Shakespeare's sonnets have a being. It's sort of not physical. It's literary being, almost, right? But we can talk about them. We do talk about them because they have existence. So substance, or ousia, being, is where we have to begin the discussion, okay? Now, here's the idea, though, is that every substance can be intellectually distinguished between, on the one hand, its matter and its form. Okay? So every substance has both matter and form. Now, but this is importantly just an intellectual distinction. So for instance, let's take my coffee cup. What is it made of? What's its matter? Because that's what matter refers to. It refers to whatever it is it's composed of. It's matter. Well, its matter is ceramic. That's what it's made of. It has this sort of ceramic clay. It's baked clay, essentially. Right? Now, it has a certain form as well. Now, the form in this case refers to its shape, literally. It has a certain sort of form, structure. So what Aristotle is saying is that everything that it has substance has matter. It's made of stuff, but that matter is informed in a certain way. It's shaped in a certain manner. And so now, but here's the idea: is you can never have matter by itself, because what would pure matter be without form? I don't know. It wouldn't really be anything, right? It needs to be informed in order for me to know what that substance is. So in order for it to be a particular being, a particular substance, it has to have matter, but the matter is always informed. And by similarity, form cannot exist without matter, because how can something take a certain sort of shape if there's nothing to take shape with? So form and matter are absolutely necessary for every being, right? You need both. Now, here's a sort of way we can understand here that's sort of interesting, is matter, we might say, is what separates substances, and form seems to be what unites substances, right? Now, what do I mean? Remember, a while back in a previous video, we talked about the idea, the problem of the one and the many, right? And there the question was, how is it that we can recognize one thing in many members, right? How is it that I can look at all of these different people and recognize that even though there's many of them, they're all the same in the sense they're all human, right? Or I can look at coffee cups. I can go to a coffee cup store and I can see all these many different things that are all different substances in the sense of they have different matter, but they're all one thing. And here's the idea, is that the matter is what separates them. So I see the coffee cups, and the reason I can recognize that they're all coffee cups is because they have like form, right? But I also recognize that they're different coffee cups because they have different matters that are informed, right? So matter is sort of the principle that allows us to recognize the separateness between particular entities, whereas form is what allows me to see what's universal among particular entities. So you can see here that Aristotle's very distinction between matter and form actually begins to address this problem here, this problem of the one and the many, okay? So that might be helpful. Now, I should mention here, let's talk a little bit about matter, right? Because matter, we can make another distinction here between physical matter and non-physical matter. And I should, well, I have to be clear here. Really, we're talking about the difference between physical and non-physical substances, because we can make the same distinction over here with form. But I think this is important because typically most people today would maybe probably consider themselves empiricist, that most people can say that they do think that knowledge comes from experience. But most people today many people are physicalists, meaning that they think the only things that are real in the world are physical things. But this is not what Aristotle thinks, right? Every substances can be physical or non-physical. But non-physical substances still have matter, right? Every substance has matter and form, regardless of whether or not it's physical or not, right? So let me give you an example here. We've already given the example of the physical matter, and we talked about the coffee cup, right? We did the coffee cup over here. But let's talk a little bit about Shakespeare's plays, right? Most of you have probably seen or read Romeo and Juliet, right? A famous Shakespeare play, frankly, not one of his best in my view. I know some of you will hate me for that. I'll probably get emails. But I'm not a fan of Romeo and Juliet. I think that there's better Shakespeare plays, but this is the one that everyone's read, right? And it's a great example. Now, Romeo and Juliet, let's think about that. Well, the truth is, I shouldn't put it down here. I should put Romeo and Juliet. Let's do this. Let's see here. No, never mind. What I wanted to do is move actually here. Never mind. I wanted to move Romeo and Juliet up here. Right, because it's a substance. It has a being of some sort. Because think about it. When we do talk about the play, so that means we think it exists. So that means if we think it exists, it has being, and thus it must be a substance of some sort. Now, what's the matter with Romeo and Juliet, right? What's the matter with Romeo and Juliet? What is it made of? And then what's its form? Well, some of us might think, well, Romeo and Juliet, what's its matter? Well, it must be it's made of a book, right? But that would be incorrect, right? Because I can take your physical book of Romeo and Juliet and I can burn it. But have I destroyed the play Romeo and Juliet? Well, no, I haven't. In fact, I could go and destroy lots and lots of books and still never destroy the play of Romeo and Juliet. Because that's not what it's made of. That's not its matter. Nor is that its form. Because think about this, it can come in all shapes and sizes, right? And think about how different Shakespearean troupes will act it out differently, right? So what exactly is the matter with Romeo and Juliet? That, by the way, that's my favorite line. I love waiting for that in this lecture because I'm not a fan of the play, right? But what's the matter with that play? Well, it's made of its characters is the answer, right? It's made of its characters. So let me erase this. I'm going to erase this here. Right? Right? If we take Romeo and Juliet, so we have physical and non-physical substances. I'm going to put it up here instead. Right? And we gave this example of Romeo and Juliet. And we can say that it's made of its characters. Right? You've got Mercutio and Romeo and obviously Juliet and so on and so forth. Right? It's made of certain characters. Now, what's the form of the play? Well, that's sort of weird. It's obviously not shape, right? It's not. It doesn't look like a cup. Well, what is it? We might say that the form of the play is the plot, right? It's the plot, right? It's the storyline. It's the narrative of what happens to those characters, right? And think about it. Think about all of the knockoffs of Romeo and Juliet. Think of West Side Story. I don't know how many of you have seen that, but West Side Story is essentially the story of Romeo and Juliet. But of course, it's a different play with a different title. It's a musical. Well, what's different? Well, notice here, the West Side Story has different characters, so it has a different matter. That's what makes it a different play. But notice we recognize the West Side Story is like Romeo and Juliet because it has a very similar form. It has a very similar plot, right? So West Side Story, right? Okay, so we can talk about physical as well as non-physical substances. And another example of substances worth mentioning here is another physical substance would be water. Think about water. Well, here it gets a little more difficult. What's the matter with water? What's water made of? Well, there's different ways of answering it. We might say that it's made of hydrogen and oxygen, right? That's what it's made of. It's made of certain molecules, right? And what's its form? Well, the form in this case cannot be shape. That doesn't make sense because if I pour water in a cup, the shape of the water is whatever object it's in, right? So the form of the water itself isn't shape. It may be something like its viscosity, or maybe even be more precise, it's the arrangement of the molecules, right? The certain particular arrangement of the hydrogen and oxygen molecules. So you can imagine, or atoms, and so you can imagine that it could be, the form could be something like that. I think the viscosity is a sort of interesting way. You can tell water by the way it feels compared to oil or blood or something like this, right? So when we talk about matter and form, this is just an intellectual distinction, but it's an important distinction because that's the way we understand how different things work, okay? So now that's what his basic concept of what a substance is, right? And by the way, notice here when we look about this, again, he starts with his experience of an object, right? Just how we've done, right? We started, here, I'll erase this again, right? You can say we started with a basic object, water, in this last case, right? And then we said, well, what has to be the case about the water? Well, it must be made of something and it must have form. So you can see again, he starts from experience and then deduces his way through intellectual distinctions in order to gain knowledge. And so that's the same process that he's going to use over and over again. Now, the next thing here that I want to talk about is what Aristotle calls the four causes. I started talking about this earlier, but I realized I was backwards. So the four causes, that is, every substance can be said to have a certain sort of cause, right? We talk about causation, things making something else occur, right? And so there's four different causes that Aristotle articulates. The first cause is what he calls the material cause. And the material cause is really quite simple. It is nothing other than what something is made of, right? So let's put over here, it's what it's made of. Now, of course, the material cause is linked up here with this very notion of matter that we just discussed. So this is the material cause, you might say, the substance, right? When we talk about matter and form. Okay, so the first is the material cause. Now, let's give an example. And the example I want to use is the example of the statue of David, right? So here's the statue of David by Michelangelo. It's a famous sculpture. So let's use this as our example, our substance, right? So let's ask ourselves, what's the material cause of this thing, this object that exists in the world? Well, in our example here, the case of David, we might say that the material cause is marble, right? That's what it's made of. It's made of marble. It's a statue of Michelangelo's that he carved out of marble. So that's the material cause. Now the second cause is the efficient cause. And the efficient cause is what generates the substance into being. Whoops, that shouldn't be it. So, right, so the question there is, the efficient cause refers to what generates the substance into being. That is, the efficient cause refers to what made this thing. How did this thing come into existence? Well, in this case, we know the answer. It's the sculptor, right? It's the sculptor. Michelangelo is actually the efficient cause, right? Or we might just say the sculptor, right? But the reason I wanted to give this sort of definition, saying what generates the substance into being, is because not everything is made by humans, right? We can talk about mountains, for instance, and we could talk about trees and forests. For Aristotle, all of these things have efficient causes. Think about, for instance, a valley that looks like this. This is what's known, this isn't a very good picture, but this is what's known as a glacier valley, right? It's a valley, it's a bowl-shaped valley. It's caused by a glacier one time going through it. So we can talk, so for instance, we can say that the valley has the efficient cause of a glacier, for instance, right? So material cause and efficient cause. So what's the third type of cause? The third cause here is the formal cause. And the formal cause refers to the form of the substance. Now this, of course, goes exactly, whoops, that's not what I wanted. This goes to this, not this one, hold on. Let's see where I was. Right? My apologies. Where is it? I'm getting lost. Here we go. Right? The formal cause refers to the form in the same way we talked about. The material cause is the matter, the formal cause is the form, right? So what's the formal cause of this statue? Well, the formal cause is that it is a man, right? It is a man, and in particular, it's a very particular man. It is the man David from the Bible, from the biblical story, right? So we might say that the formal cause of the statue is David, right? It's David. So number 4 here, and here's the last one, is that there's the final cause. And the final cause refers to why why the substance exists. Why the substance exists. The question of why. Okay? So you might go, if we go back to the statue of David, we can ask, whoops, why does this statue exist? Now, our historians, of course, know the answer to this better than we do, right? An art historian will tell us what the answer is. I'm not exactly sure exactly why the statue of David was commissioned. I know it was commissioned originally in Florence, so I imagine for aesthetic and religious reasons, because originally this thing was on top of a huge dome, basilica dome. So I probably for aesthetic and religious reasons, probably, right? So we'll just put aesthetics, right? So that means that when we take the example of when we look at the four causes again, the four causes, the first is the material cause, and the material cause is what something is made of. Then the second is the efficient cause, and that is a way of referring to how something comes into existence, how the being of the substance is generated. The formal cause refers to what the form of the substance is, what the thing is, right? And then the final cause refers to why the thing exists. Uh, Sometimes I'll tell my classes that the material cause is the what, the efficient cause is the how did it come into existence? Um, well, the formal cause is an answer to the question, what is it? The efficient cause is an answer to the question of how comes it, right? How does it come into existence? The the material cause is, oh, I'm sorry, I made a mistake there. Let me erase that. The material cause refers to what is it made of, which I guess I have up there, so I didn't even write that. But the material cause refers to what it's made of. The efficient cause is to answer the question, how comes it? The formal cause is, what is it? Not what it's made of, but what exactly is the thing itself. And then the final cause answers the question, why is it? Right? Why does it exist? Right? So we've got the material cause, the efficient cause, the formal cause, and the final cause, right? So just as an example, let's find something else to talk about. So for instance, let's take our painting that we originally looked at here, the School of Athens, right? Now the question is let's go through it. What is the material cause of this painting? We'd have to go back and look. I don't believe it's a fresco. I believe it's actually a painting. So we might say it's made of canvas and it's made of certain sorts of oily pigments and whatever that Raphael created. So that's the first thing. That's what it's made of. What's its efficient cause? Its efficient cause is the painter. It's Raphael. What is the formal cause? The formal cause is that it is a picture of philosophers, philosophers in some sort of kind of idealistic Greek temple, right? It's a scene of philosophy, essentially. That's its formal cause. It's a bunch of different people. And what's its final cause? Its final cause is probably to evoke a study of history and philosophy, something like that. So every object has material, efficient, formal, and final in Aristotle's view. Now, the interesting question is, what does modern science talk about? Does modern science talk about, let me erase all this is all just a mess. Does modern science talk about material, efficient, formal, and final causes? Well, we could say that what modern science does is modern science talks about the first three, but not the last, right? And I think this is a sort of an important point, right? Is that modern science looks at these causes here, right? Contemporary science, chemistry, for instance, is concerned with what is things made of, right? Evolution, for instance, is concerned with how things came into existence, the efficient cause. Chemistry as well, or physics, is concerned with formal causes. But what about this category, the final cause category? Why do things exist? Today, science says that this is unavailable to us. And why is that? Well, for Aristotle, he had this notion that the world has telos. And the word telos means something like the end or goal towards which all things aim. And the idea here is that everything that exists has a certain sort of purpose, right? So Aristotle views the world as imbued with purpose all throughout it. And that part of the goal of science, whoops, I misspelled that, didn't I? Part of the goal of science is to determine what those purposes are. Here we go. The world has purpose. It's part of the goal for Aristotle, he thought, was that science was to figure out what the purpose is. Now, today, though, we don't have a teleological view of the universe anymore. We don't think that the world is created with a certain world is created, or that everything has a certain purpose. We think that things function together in a certain way, but we remain agnostic on the question of whether or not there's a purpose or goal in the world. And so modern science looks at material causes, efficient causes, and formal causes, but final causes have been stripped from science. So you can say, to a certain extent, this is part of the difference between modern and archaic science, and certainly the difference between Aristotle. Now, so that's sort of an interesting sort of point worth mentioning. Okay. So anyway, we'll come back to this stuff later. So those are that's what the four causes are. So again, just as a sort of brief review to sort of stick with us and be clear what we've discussed, we've talked about Aristotle's notion of substance, and now we've talked about his notion of cause, what the causes are. What I want to talk about now are the categories. And this actually comes out of Aristotle's logic, but it's related to his physics quite a bit. Oops, hold on a second here. Okay, and so here are the categories. And that is, Aristotle thinks that science investigates all substances through the use of 10 different categories. Now, again, what he's doing is he's splicing up the ways in which we actually can investigate what things are all about. We can investigate truth. The first category, and this is known as the primary category, is the category of substance, right? Which we already discussed refers to matter and form and all of that business. This is the principal category, right? The primary category. But we also talk about beings in terms of their location, right? Where something is. We talk about them in terms of their time, right? For instance, you can talk about the length of time it takes for a glacier to create a glacier valley, right? So we can talk about beings in terms of their time. We talk about them in terms of their quantity, right? We can say there's 5 glaciers versus 2. We can also talk about things in terms of their quality, right? What kinds of things they are. How good are those things? For instance, you can talk about the quality of a river, for instance, right? Or the quality of a production of Hamlet, right? We can also talk about the relationship between things. So, for instance, we could talk about the quality of snow or the quality of the ice and its relationship to the air temperature at the time that the snow fell. For instance, this is the kind of things that climatologists talk about. We can talk about the posture of things, right? The way in which things are compose themselves, if you will. We can also talk about the state of things. Are things in a state of atrophy? Are they in a state of growth? And so on and so forth. We also talk about things in terms of whether or not are they doing something. Is there an activity of the thing? We also talk about them in terms of whether or not they can undergo things. Undergoing something. Right? So there's these 10 categories. And science, he thinks, sort of tackles the investigation of the world through these 10 categories. I don't know why I'm underlining everything, but for some reason it feels right. Okay, so let me give you an example. Let's take an example. Well, let's go to our statue of David. Again, right? Sort of remind ourselves what it looks like here. Well, never mind. Don't worry about it. Right, let's take the statue of David. Well, what's its substance? Its substance, well, that's when we talk about the distinction between matter and form, but essentially we could say it's a marble statue, right? We talk about it in terms of its location. It's located in Florence. We talk about it in terms of its time. It was created in the 15th century. Its quantity, there's only one of them. In its quality, it's considered one of the most valuable marble statues in all the world, so it's a very high quality. We can talk about its relationship. For instance, now whenever you talk about relationship, you're talking about the relationship between the statue of David in this case and some other substance. So, for instance, we can talk about the relationship of David to the sculptor Michelangelo. What did Michelangelo think of the statue? So we can talk about its relationship. We can talk about its posture, how it exists in the world. So, for instance, in the case of the statue of posture, we might talk about how it's set up, how it has a certain sort of posture. We can talk about its state, whether or not. Now, of course, state means we're going to categorize it as well in some way. We can say the statue is in a miserable state. It needs to be cleaned, for instance. Whether or not it's doing something, it doesn't really do anything, but we could talk about other substances that do things, like animals, for instance, or clouds and mountains. And whether or not it's undergoing something, right? We could say that the statue of David is undergoing, pressures from the air quality or something like this that make it dirty, and so on and so forth. Now, I haven't given you maybe the best example of the 10 categories, but Aristotle thinks that these 10 categories are sufficient for the investigation of the world, right? And so now you can see what we've got here is we've got these categories. We also have the notion of that the world is teleological, or it has a certain telos to it. And so Aristotle sees the world in this sort of thing. But all of it, again, begins with our experience. And what he's saying is we have a certain sort of experience of the world, and the goal for us is to understand that experiences in terms of the substance, its causation, and its categories, and telos, and so forth, right? Now, you can see here we're really building up Aristotle's conception of how he understands the world, but we haven't gotten to the unmoved mover, and we haven't really discussed a really principal problem in philosophy, and that's the problem of change. Why is it that things are changing? Now remember, Plato points upward in that painting, and he's pointing to the realm of being because he distrusts our experience of the changing world. Being is real, becoming is just a bad version for Plato. Aristotle thinks, no, this is the real world, this is the only world, and so that means Aristotle has to explain, well, how is this world changing? And why is this world changing? Because he's got to solve this problem. Plato solves it by just duplicating the world with the forms. Aristotle's got to do something really radically different because he has to also maintain that the world that is changing is real, right? And you've got to solve this problem of the one and the many and the being and becoming and all of these sorts of intricate issues. How's he going to do it? Well, he's going to do it by saying whenever we talk about things changing, one of the things we should recognize is that we have to postulate two categories. The first category is the category of actuality. And the second category is the category of potentiality. Right? So every substance has both of these things. Has actuality and potentiality. Now, actuality refers to how something actually is at a particular moment. Let's put at a moment. Right? And potentiality refers to what something could be. What something could be, right? Okay, so that means that we have let's take a particular substance, right? Well, let's take the statue of David as an example, right? In actuality, the statue of David is a statue of marble that's in a museum in Florence. But potentially, it could be a lot of things, right? You could imagine that someone could, God forbid, someone breaks in, steals the statue, and then grinds it to dust, and then uses the dust to, create cement, and they pave their driveway with it or something, right? That would be horrible. But you can see that's something that it could be. It's within the potential of the statue of David. Every substance has a certain range of potential. But the thing to note here is not everything, right? So every substance has a certain sort of potential, but the potential is really determined by its matter-form structure, right? Right? Because if something is made of its matter determines a certain side of the potential, and so does its form, right? So that means that, for instance, take water. Water has the potential, like liquid water, has the potential to become ice cubes, or it also has the potential to become steam, for instance. And that is dependent upon its form and matter at a particular point in its actual state. Now, here's the thing is that for Aristotle, even though we're talking about potential, he thinks this is real. Right? This is something that really exists. You really do have it. This is a metaphysical category par excellence, right? Because he wants to say that if things have actuality, then the only way we can explain change is to say that in some sense they must also have, at the same time that they're actual, they have a certain sort of potentiality that exists for them. And that potentiality comes out in change. It comes out in time. Now, what is time in Aristotle's view? Aristotle says that time is simply the measurement of movement, right? And think about it. How is it that I measure time? So for instance, right now in this video, I'm about 45, 50 minutes in. How do I know that? Well, the only reason I know what time it is because I've literally seen movement in the clock, right? And the only way I recognize that time is happening, things are changing, is because I literally see movement happening. Right? And think about how is it that we describe, whenever you see the movies that want to pretend that you could freeze time, how is it they describe what it would look like if there was no time? They make everything stop moving. So time is really the measurement of movement in Aristotle's view. And so that means that when we're talking about change, we're really asking the question of how is it that things are moving? How is movement possible? And his idea here is that movement can only be possible if we postulate a category of potentiality. So let me see if I can give you an example here that can sort of show you how this would function. So here's actuality and here's the category of potentiality. And here's where I'm just put an action pot here to describe them. And here I'm going to have to ask you to sort of bear with me as I draw some pictures. And I want to tell you a story of change. I want to tell you the story of a human life. Right, in really basic categories. The first thing that happens in a human life, we all begin, is we're little babies, right? And I apologize, here's my baby. Right? We're all babies in the beginning. We're infants, right? And so at one point we all actually were, our actuality was such that we were just babies. But while we were babies, we had a potential to become children, to become toddlers, right? And over time, that potential gets actualized where we actually do become children, right? But when we're children, now here's the notice is you have a certain sort of actuality that gets potential. You have a certain sort of potential at the same time. But when that potential is actualized into a new movement, then new potentialities emerge, right? Now, from being a boy or being a child, we might say that I or we have the potential to become adults, right? And then eventually, if we're lucky, most of us are, that gets actualized and we become adults, right? Now, as an adult, I have other potentials, right? So, for instance, I have the potential to become, here's my picture I have the potential to become an old man, right? It looks like a mermaid or something, but it's fine. I hope you're laughing at home and not cursing. But I have the potential to become an old man. Eventually, that will become realized, if I'm lucky again. I'll become an old man. And then eventually, I'll have the potential, to die, right? R.I.P., right? And then, of course, maybe my ashes, once I am dead, right? I have the potential, my ashes, to become a tree or something like this, right? Or something like this. So you could see here at each stage, right? Now again, when we talk about actuality, this is what we actually experience, right? So, these are the stages of a human life, right? Going from infancy to childhood to adulthood to becoming an elderly person to finally dying, right? This is the arc. But at each one of these stages, I have a corollary potential, right? So while I'm an infant, I have the potential of being a child. Now, but while I'm a child, and when I'm a child, I have the potential of being an adult. But notice, my potential becomes limited over time, right? Because when I'm a child, I don't have potential to become an infant again, right? That's not in the deck of cards. This is why Aristotle thought there must be a sort of directionality to things, and they must be headed towards this notion of telos, because the potential sort of narrows, right, in a certain sort of sense, right? Because I can't go back, as it were. And such that when I become an old when I'm an adult and have the potential of being an old man, I no longer have the potential of being the child or the adult, right? Because that's been actualized already, and there's a sort of trajectory, right? A telos that's it's sort of headed for, and of course, unfortunately, it keeps going. Now, but here's the thing: we said earlier that this is really about movement, right? How things move. So even I've just given you really basic sort of I've condensed a human life into 5 moments, right? But actually, at every moment of every day, this is happening. Literally, when I move my hand, I'm actualizing a certain potential that existed. But once I make that movement, those potentials are lost, right? And now different potentials emerge. So quite literally, this is constantly happening. There's sort of this flow of actuality, potentiality. Now, some of you at home are watching this and thinking, okay, Mark, you've told us how Aristotle explains motion, but you haven't explained why, right? Remember, we talked about the 4 different causes. I've given you here what we might call the formal cause of change or something like this. But what we really need to know is how did all of it start and why did all of it start, right? Well, let's go back here. The first way, if we're going to talk about how change began, how movement began, then we have to begin by asking this question, which is, which one of these has logical priority? Actuality or potentiality? Which one is more fundamental? Now, no, I say logically prior, not temporally prior. I want to know not which one came first in time. I want to know which one comes first necessarily. Which one is more necessary than the other? Well, let's think about it. If potentiality was logically prior, then that means that actuality could come from potentiality. But the problem is, potentiality, the only way that potentialities get limited is by a certain type of actuality, right? So when I'm the child, right, I have a certain range of potential that doesn't include being a child or that doesn't include being a child or an infant or a zygote or whatever, right? And it also doesn't include other sorts of things, right? So that means that the actuality seems to actually determine what the potentiality is. So that's the first point, is that number one, it looks like actuality determines the field of potentiality. Right? It determines it. And also there's the second thing is that it must also have, I have to be careful here, not temporal priority, but if we looked in terms of time, if potentiality was logically prior, then we might say that maybe it began first in time. If that was the case, then nothing could ever exist from the beginning. So actuality is actually the principal category here. Uh-oh, what did I just do? Right? The answer here is, I'm going to erase this. I don't like this. I think it's a little confusing, but we see an argument that he gives a temporal argument. So, but the answer here is going to be that actuality is what's logically prior, and so let's signify it by circling it. And that's because potentiality is always determined by what's actual, right? That is, actuality sort of determines what the field of potential possibilities are. So that means that actuality is logically prior. Okay. Now, Aristotle actually believed that the universe was cyclical and that it was infinite. So that means that it just went on and over and over again, right? So Aristotle never asked the question, how did the universe begin? His answer is this process of actuality and potential has just always been happening, right? So there's no one moment in time where it begins, right? There's no God that creates it at any particular moment X, right? It's cyclical and has always been happening. So actuality, it doesn't have temporal priority, but it has logical priority, right? So that means that if we're to answer the question, how exactly is everything, this is the understanding for how things change or describing change, but how is it what's the efficient cause? How do things begin at all? The answer is that whatever the efficient cause is, it must be purely actual and have no potentiality, right? So this is what's going to be known here as Aristotle's conception of the unmoved mover. And his idea here is that the unmoved mover, number one, we should say this is known by deduction. So the unmoved mover is purely a deduction. That is, we have to postulate the unmoved mover. Because if we're going to explain why things are changing, we have to say that at bottom, there must be something that has pure actuality. But if it is purely actual, then that must mean that it has no potentiality. But if it has no potentiality, that means that there's no movement, right? And thus, there's no change either. Right? Now, but here's the problem, is everything in my experience I'm experiencing everything that is changing, which means that this is not subject to experience. It's not experienced. I don't see the unmoved mover. Rather, I postulate the necessity of something that's purely actual. And that's all I mean by the unmoved mover. And his idea here is that the unmoved mover, now that's the notion of how the unmoved mover is unmoved, right? But as pure actuality, the unmoved mover is in a certain sense responsible for all other movement, right? Because think about it, nothing can be responsible for its own movement fundamentally. So go back to our example here of the child, right? The child does not have pure actuality. That's what enables it to have the potential of the infant. That's how the infant has the potential to be a child, or the child has the potential to be an adult, and so on and so forth, is because it has actuality, but it's not pure actuality. That's because it's changing through time. Now, which means that if we go back in time, where was the child from? Well, the child is the actualization of the potential of its parents mating, right? And so on and so forth. So that means that the child came from a previous point in which the parents were reproducing. Where did the parents come from? They came from their previous point, which is their parents, and so on and so forth. So that means that none of these things in themselves can be responsible for the next stage, right? Nothing. So the question is, what is fully responsible? Well, it has to be something that's purely actual. And if it's purely actual, it has to be responsible in some sense for the movement of other substances, because no substance can be responsible for its own movement logically. So that means that this mover it's unmoved, and yet it moves. It is both, on the one hand, never changing, and yet somehow it's a necessary feature for other things to change. Although it's an inadequate example, I think a way of seeing this is to imagine this doesn't look very nice, but imagine a roundabout. How does a roundabout work? A roundabout works when a car drives up, they drive around, right? And they drive around the roundabout, and then they move into a certain different direction, and all the cars do it in certain ways. But think about the roundabout itself. Is the roundabout moving? No, it's not moving. Is the roundabout responsible for the motion of the cars? Yes, it is in a certain way. So you can see here that that's obviously that doesn't work, because even the roundabout as a substance in time has potentiality. So it's not, the unmoved mover isn't a roundabout, obviously. But the unmoved mover functions in a similar sort of manner, right? So this process of going from potentiality to actuality, to potentials to actualities, to potentials and actualities, right? Because remember, he conceives of the universe in terms of a cyclical process in time. So it looks something like this. But all of this is occurring, and the reason it can't continue to occur is because we have actuality, something that is fully real and actual at the bottom, right? And this is a structural sort of definition. So this is, and by the way, some people call this Aristotle's concept of God. But we have to be really careful here, because the unmoved mover isn't God in the normal sense, right? If the unmoved mover is God, let's, right here, what are the characteristics of the unmoved mover? Well, the characteristic number one is that there's no movement. If there's no movement, then there can be no creation, right? Because creation is an act of movement, right? If there's no movement, then there can be no person. There can be no person to God, right? God, the unmoved mover here isn't conscious like we're conscious, because consciousness occurs in time and it occurs through experience of change. None of that's the case, right? So the unmoved mover doesn't have any of these. The unmoved mover is purely actual, right? But that doesn't tell us much more than that. So we can say that in a certain way, the unmoved mover is responsible for the world, but is not the creator of the world, right? There's a sort of responsibility that the unmoved mover has for the world in terms of it being a sort of structural thing of pure actuality, but it doesn't. The unmoved mover doesn't create the world. That's why he sees the world as always existing in a cyclical process through time, right? But this notion of the unmoved mover is really quite critical for Aristotle, right? Because it explains, so then the question is, what's the final cause of all things? The final cause of things is this first principle, right? Which is the unmoved mover, right? And I know that this is ultimately probably insufficient because I'm trying to give you a sort of kind of quick run through of Aristotle's entire metaphysical view here in an hour, and it's not possible to do well, but I want you to see how all these pieces come together, right? Again, what have we seen here to review? And then we'll conclude our lesson. We've seen that everything that exists has substance. Well, actually, let me go back here. To a full review here would be the idea that we've seen that first knowledge begins with our experience of the world, and what we experience are substances. Right? We experience our substances. These substances have matter and form. And we can investigate these substances in terms of how they come to exist, the four causes. And we can also investigate them in terms of these 10 categories. Right? But what we finally notice is that all of these substances are a combination of potentiality and actuality. Right? Now, where does potentiality and actuality come from? It requires this notion of pure actuality, right? Because no substance is purely actual, which means no substance is ever responsible for itself. What is responsible for the world must be something that's purely actual. And something that's purely actual can only be something like this unmoved mover, which means the unmoved mover is the first principle. The first principle for the world. That is, the unmoved mover is the final cause for why the world is the way it is, right? So you can see here, what I want you to see here is that Aristotle begins with a very sort of, I think, a very nice way of beginning with our experience. And then he sort of moves through this process of deduction and says, well, if this is the case, then this is the case, and then these are the case, and if we want to understand that things are changing, then we've got to postulate this, which leads us ultimately to this. So this is by a process of deduction, right? And it's very different from Plato. Now, what is Aristotle's basic criticism of Plato? And I don't really have much time of it, but we can call this its famous argument he gives here is what's known as the third man argument. Right? And remember, go back here to this, Aristotle's pointing at the world and Plato's pointing upwards, right? And what does Plato think? Right? Plato's view is that there's two types of reality. There's being and there's becoming. Right? This is Plato's sort of worldview here, right? And Plato's worldview is that there's a form and that the form participates in the particulars. And that's what enables but all of in the world of becoming. So, for instance, if the form is horseness, right? The form of horse. There's particular types of horses, right? There's short horses. There's ponies. There's Clydesdales, etc., etc. There's all these different ones. All of these are imperfect versions of the perfect notion of horse, the perfect notion of form. Form is what's true, right? Now, but here's the problem Aristotle has. Aristotle says that, well, wait a second. If these each down here are imperfect versions of this form up here, then that means there's differences among them. So if there's differences, then we should be able to postulate that there must be intermediary forms, right? That is, take a to imagine a horse that's missing a tail. The perfect form of horse probably includes an idea of a tail, which means that there must be a sort of in-between version between the perfect version, right, and the imperfect version. But wait a second, that means that in order to understand, let's do it like this. In order to understand the form, we actually have to say that there's this intermediate form, or there is a third form. But if there's a third form, there must be a fourth form, and a fifth form, and a sixth form. Ultimately, what he thinks is that Plato hasn't explained the world with the forms. Plato's just merely duplicated the world. And you can't explain the world simply by duplicating it. And so what Aristotle says is that what you've got to do to explain the world is you've got to get rid of all this stuff up here and just talk about this as the real world, right? Don't duplicate it at all. This is what's real, each of these different things. And the way in which we sort of understand them all as being horses is because we recognize the form within the matter, right? And so on and so forth. And so he thinks that Plato's theory of the forms doesn't actually explain the world, it just duplicates the world, thus duplicating the very problem, right? Now, I want to conclude here with the final thought. About whether, because it looks like here many of you probably are thinking, well, Aristotle's right on the mark here, right? I'm a big fan of Aristotle. But is Aristotle always right about everything? Well, I want to tell you quickly about a story about Aristotle's cosmology, right? And remember, Aristotle thinks that knowledge comes from experience. And so imagine if I want to understand why the world is the way it is, why the cosmos are composed in the way they are, then what I might do is I might say, go out and look at the heavens. And what would I see if I go outside and look? I see that while I'm standing outside, the sun is moving around the sky. It's moving from east to west. This is the sun, right? And so it looks like from my experience that the universe is spinning around me. And in fact, Aristotle, because of that, he created an entire cosmology, right? Where the Earth was the center of the universe. And then you had these different spheres that were sort of cycling around the Earth. And this is precisely false. This is what Aristotle thought, and in the Middle Ages, this was the view that was defended in the beginning of the 16th century against the scientific revolution, right? Against the heliocentric model of the universe that says, no, the sun is in the center and the Earth is orbiting around the sun, right? What I want you to see here is that Aristotle's view can lead, this idea that knowledge comes from experience can indeed lead us to false conclusions, which raises an important question for us, whether or not Aristotle's his metaphysics and epistemology are ultimately sufficient. Anyway, it raises some interesting question for us about whether or not Aristotle's conclusions really are true. And that, after all, was where we began. I'll conclude there. Thank you for watching. I'll see you guys online.